Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Shall we start inshallah? We've got a lot to cover and I don't know if I'll be able to get through it all, but I will try my best. Now, where we last left off was Uhud has happened. It was a momentous change. Everyone is celebrating, but like I said, there were a few families that were weeping because they've just lost their family members. In Mecca, Abu Sufyan is furious. He is absolutely furious about what's happened. He makes an oath that he's not going to shower till he takes revenge on the Muslims, right? Then 1 month later, so my thoughts are, so he didn't shower for 1 month, possibly. 1 month later, Abu Sufyan and 200 Meccans attacked the suburbs of Medina, so on the outskirts of Medina. They kill 2 Muslims and they cut down several palm trees and they capture quite a few sacks of barley. When the Prophet ﷺ hears this, he immediately sends a detachment to go and chase them down. They catch up with Abu Sufyan, and in order to escape, what they do is they throw out all the barley that they looted. So the Muslims were able to recover all the barley.
50 sacks or something?
I don't know exactly how much, but there was about 200 Meccans. So I assume 1 sack each Meccan, I don't know, about 200 sacks of barley. Yeah, significant amount, but they couldn't get away with it. But Abu Sufyan escaped. In the same year, Omar's brother-in-law, Uthman ibn Mazun, dies from a natural cause. Now, Uthman was extremely pious and aesthetic, pretty much. And it was to Uthman that the Prophet ﷺ said about being moderate. So it was to Uthman that he said, "Have you not seen me as an example? Verily, eyes have their rights over you, and your body has rights, and your family has rights. So pray, sleep, fast, and break fast." This was told to Uthman because Uthman was someone who was constantly praying. We're not talking about the famous Uthman. This is a different Uthman. Uthman ibn Mazun. Constantly praying, constantly fasting. So when he passes away, Omar is shocked because Omar can't understand how someone so pious and so devoted to Islam could die in a natural cause. Because in Omar's mind, all the great people die as martyrs. Why is this the case? And Omar obviously had to change his mind because later Abu Bakr passes away from natural causes, and so does the Prophet. So it's not. So martyrdom doesn't necessarily mean pious, and pious doesn't necessarily mean martyrdom for them. Another thing is interesting is that Uthman's burial, an elderly woman says that Uthman will soon enter the doors of Jannah. And the Prophet ﷺ very gently tells her not to speak on behalf of Allah. We don't know this, but all we can say is that Uthman loved the Prophet and loves Allah, and to leave it at that. Yeah. Another incident, which is interesting, so we're getting to Badr, but there's a couple of incidents between Uhud and Badr that I'm just covering off really quickly. One of the Sahaba, Abu Lubaba, is falsely accused of taking a palm tree belonging to an orphan. Now the Prophet ﷺ asks Abu Lubaba to give the tree back. Abu Lubaba stubbornly refuses because he says, "I haven't done anything wrong, that's a false accusation, I didn't take it." The Prophet asks her once again and says, "Can you please return it? And in return, I can promise you that there will be a tree for you in paradise." And Abu Lubaba still refuses. So he was pretty stubborn. He still refuses. Hearing this, another Sahaba, Thabit ibn Dadaha, offers Abu Lubaba an entire orchard for that tree, which he then gives to the orphan so he can have the tree in Jannah. So he makes this deal. He said, "All right, I will have the tree in Jannah, I'm giving you an orchid, you give me the tree, and I'll give the tree to the orphans." It's interesting because it shows the consciousness of these Sahaba towards the hereafter, towards the unseen, which is something I was always... for me, I struggle with because I act and react based on what my five senses see. My conscious isn't always connected to the unseen, but for these Sahaba, the unseen was just as real as the seen. But don't judge Abu Lubaba too harshly because the Prophet ﷺ didn't. He was later given important missions and he was loved by the Prophet. But Sahaba are humans and they have their own stubbornnesses and annoyances. Now the Prophet ﷺ's household after Badr was like this. Fatima was 20 and yet unmarried. Now so Prophet encourages Ali to marry, but Ali says he's very poor. But with the Prophet ﷺ's encouragement, he finally agrees. The wedding is a very simple wedding, and their room has barely anything in it. After all the guests have gone, the Prophet ﷺ visits them and blesses them. But the thing is, Ali is so poor, he cannot get a house near the center of Medina, where the Prophet ﷺ is living and the mosque. So he gets a house quite far away. This makes the Prophet sad, because he wants to be with Ali and Fatima and closer. Harith ibn Nuam, a Khazraj Sahaba, sees how this is upsetting the Prophet, and he says, I will give you my house, and gives it as a gift for Fatima and Ali to live in. Another interesting thing to note is that since Hijrah, more and more poor Muslims are entering into Medina. So they're starting to come to Medina. And they don't have a place to stay. They don't even have enough money as Ali does to get one house further away. So the Prophet ﷺ sets up a platform on the mosque. And these Sahaba lived on that platform. They literally lived there. And they lived off the generosity of other Muslims. And they devoted their lives 24/7 to Islam. Anyone know a famous Sahaba? Abu Huraira. And Abu Huraira is famous because he had the highest number of hadiths as well. He had, yes, he has a kitten, but yes, but he also had, and one of the Sahaba actually asked him, how is it that you didn't relatively live for a shorter period of time with the Prophet ﷺ, and I lived for longer, but you know so much hadith and I know less? And he said, because you have a family, you worked, you did business, you went to the market. All I did was sit in the Prophet's mosque and memorize every single thing that happened. This is the uniqueness of Abu Huraira. Now these Sahaba were known as Ahl as-Sufa. For those who are interested in the Sufi aspects of Islam, there is a theory that the word Sufi actually comes from the Sahaba, the Ahl as-Sufa, the people of the veranda or the people of the platform. One of the people that looked after these Ahl as-Sufa the most was the Prophet ﷺ and Fatima. And they pretty much adopted these people who were sitting in the mosque and learning about Islam. Around this time, a 10-year-old boy also joins the household. His mother sends this boy to learn with the Prophet, to grow up, and to be the Prophet ﷺ's personal assistant. Anyone know his name? Anas ibn Malik, yes. He joins the household as well. And Abdullah ibn Masud spends a lot of time with the Prophet ﷺ. So Abdullah ibn Masud's going in and out. Anas ibn Malik and Abdullah ibn Masud become two of the greatest scholars of hadith. They become the greatest muhaddiths because they are constantly, like Abu Huraira, in the vicinity of the Prophet and constantly memorizing everything that he was doing and saying. Khawla bint Hakim also comes to the Prophet's household after the death of her husband and assists the Prophet ﷺ with the house chores and his wife and looking after the house. So this, like I said before, the Prophet's house was a very dynamic house. It was never secluded. It was literally open door policy. Everyone walked in, everyone walked out, everyone pretty much felt at home, cleaned the house for him, whether they knew him very closely or not, and he was happy with that. Now, after the Battle of Badr, a significant political shift has happened that the people of the Arabian Peninsula, the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, has had to make a choice. They had to go either to ally themselves with the Meccans, or they've had to make a choice to ally themselves with the Medinans or the Muslims. A lot of coastal tribes like the Juhaynan and the Muzayna, they ally with the Medinans. The more inland tribes like the Ghatafan and the Hawazin ally themselves with the Meccans. Now, there's also an important reason. There are two trade routes going into Syria. One is along the coastal route, which now the Muslims and their allies control, and one going inland, which the Meccans and their allies still control. The Prophet ﷺ makes preemptive strikes against the allied tribes of Mecca. On one such preemptive strike, a Muslim in one preemptive strike, the Muslims are chasing this tribe called the Bani Muharib. The Bani Muharib are a sub-tribe of Hawazin, right? So they've attacked them, they're in retreat, the Prophet and his companions are chasing them, and they get to a point where they're quite tired, so they stop to rest. And the Prophet ﷺ falls asleep. He's suddenly awoken by this prodding on his chest, and he wakes up to get up, and he sees a Dutur ibn al-Harith, who was a chief of the MAGHREB tribe, he has sneaked around the Prophet, and while all the companions have slept, come up to the Prophet and kept the sword right on his chest and woken the Prophet up. And he comes to the Prophet and says, and asks the Prophet, who will stop me from killing you now? Now there is no one around the Prophet. All the Sahaba are asleep or further away, and he doesn't even have his sword with him. And he says, you're done for. Who's going to save you now? And he gives one word. He says, Allah. The minute he says Allah, Abu Dutur goes flying backwards. And the Prophet ﷺ later says that Jibril just appeared and shoved him back. He goes flying backwards and he falls and he drops his sword. And the Prophet ﷺ grabs the sword, puts it on his neck and says, who will stop me from killing you now? And what stops it is that Abu Dutara realizes a miracle's pretty much happened, and he says the Shahada straight away. And he later goes back and tries to convince his tribe to become Muslim. So even amongst the allies of the Meccans now, people are starting to become Muslims. Now, while all this is happening, back in Medina, Banu Nadir, everyone knows what Banu Nadir was, one of the Jewish tribes. Banu Nadir is causing problems. They're trying to create a stir and create animosity against the Muslims, especially a leader by the name of Ka'b ibn Ashraf. He went to Mecca and he tried to encourage the Meccans to come back and fight the Muslims again. He also started creating insulting poetry against the Muslims to try to bring them down, and tried to rally the non-Muslims in Medina against the Muslims. Now this was a clear breach of the pact. The Prophet ﷺ always knew about Ka'b's actions and his thoughts and the fact that Banu Nadir was plotting. But he never, and I think I told you this last week, he never took action. He never took action until an act was done. So he always tolerated evil thoughts, but he would not tolerate evil action. And when news came that he has now gone and had a chat with the Quraysh and was actually creating these secret alliances, the Prophet ﷺ called his companions and said, what are we to do with them? And the 4 companions came up with a solution which people criticize, but it's odd to criticize. They said, we will assassinate him. The problem here is this Ka'b. He's not Banu Nadir as a whole, yet it's Ka'b. And we're in a state of war. Ka'b has made a pact with us. He's now clearly broken the pact. This is nothing less than treason, and we have to act on it. So these 4 companions assassinate Banu Nadir. Assassinate Ka'b. Now, when Banu Nadir complains, the Prophet ﷺ explains that while Banu Nadir's hostility, he was tolerant of hostile thoughts, but as a political and military leader whose lives depended on him, he could not tolerate hostile actions in a state of war.
Because the risk was that thousands of
people would die.
innocent people.
So he had to make a decision, not just as a prophet, but he had to make a decision as a military leader and a political leader, as a statesman, to protect the people who have given their oath and allegiance and was depending on him. And when Ka'b was creating problems, he had to knock it off before it could escalate. She had a little thing to read, but I don't know where. Here it is. So Shaykh Hamza Yusuf talks about this. He says, you have to see the Prophet, God Sallallahu as a prophet and also a leader of a government. By the nature of governance, you cannot allow certain things to happen without serious punishment as a consequence, because if you do, then it leads to anarchy. Although his dominant characteristic is mercy, you'll see that he will show his just side by only when it's necessary, and in times when it's not necessary, he will always be going to forgive. But the time when it is necessary are the times of war. Their security and their lives are based on his judgment and his decisions. He sees the treachery that's going on and he has to stop it. This is a message to Banu Nadir. If you make oaths and you break them, then this is your recompense. Now, around this time, another thing happens. Omar's son-in-law passes away, And his daughter Hafsa is widowed. And after a while of mourning, Omar tries to find someone to marry Hafsa, but no one's really willing to marry him. So Omar goes to the Prophet ﷺ and pretty much whinges to him, saying, I've got a daughter no one wants to marry, I don't know what to do with her. And the Prophet ﷺ says, I will marry her. And so Hafsa now joins the Prophet ﷺ's household. Anyone know, now I've given you clues, who's in this household? So let's start with the wives. How many wives are in this household? Yes, Aisha's here. Yeah. No, not yet. Khadija's passed away a long time ago. It's Sauda, Aisha, and Hafsa. Yeah. Sorry, Zainab, not his wife, Zainab, his daughter, has come as well. So Zainab, his daughter, is in the household as well. So from his children, there's Zainab, Kulthum, and Fatima. And he has two grandchildren, Unama, who's Zainab's daughter, and Hassan, Fatima. It's a pretty packed household. On top of that, there's the adopted kids. There's Ali, who's married to Fatima. There's Zayd ibn Harith, who's still in that household, and who's married to Ayman and has a son, Usama, from Zayd. And Zayd's also married to Zainab. So there's a lot of people living in this household, 3 generations. Correct. Pretty much. It's a very, I'd probably say, if you've been to Medina, they have a model. Probably half the size of this hall. Probably half the size of this hall is the court, and then each of them probably like these rooms on the side. So all these people living in that small space.
So what happened to Zainab Jahsh? She was married to Zayd.
Later, not yet. Later. Now, the Meccans coastal, remember I said the coastal trade route is now blocked because all the allies in the coastal route, all the tribes in the coastal area are allied with the Medinans. So they're using the trade route that goes through the inland route. One news reaches the Prophet ﷺ that one such trading caravan is heavily laden with goods and it's going through that route. So the Prophet ﷺ sends 100 horsemen led by Zayd to capture it. He intercepts and he captures this pretty much small fortune. This is a financial disaster for the Quraysh because they were always worried that that trade route might fall, because if that trade route fell, they've got nothing. And remember, the Quraysh lived off trade. Now, what Zayd and those 100 horsemen showed is that even that trade route is no longer safe. Now they're in real dire situation. The Meccans were terribly anxious and worried about the prospects of life now at stake, with no hope whatsoever for any possible rehabilitation of commercial life or redemption of former prestige at the socio-political level, except through 2 avenues, categorically contrasting, giving up all symbols of pride and all attitudes of arrogance through the reconciliation with new state of affairs and the peaceableness with Muslims, or launching a decisive, overpowering war with the aim of crushing down the military forces of Medina. It was apparent through the process of events that the Quraysh had opted for the second alternative. This triggered the Battle of Badr. They felt they had no option, they were financially in deep trouble, and they started to gather forces. As the Prophet ﷺ is celebrating the birth of Hassan, and his household's all very happy about it, news reaches him about the Meccans. They have put together a huge force, even for that time, a huge force, 3,000 men. 3,000 men, 200 horsemen. And they have already had a head start. They're marching towards Medina. In the army is Abu Sufyan, but also in the army is Abu Sufyan's wife, Hind, and also a person that Hind recruited. You know who this is? Washi. And he has a secret mission. I'm sure you know, but I won't tell you yet. The march reaches the outskirts of Medina on the northern side, marching along the western coast, and sets up camp just south of Uhud. Right. So if you assume this is Uhud, right? Uhud's not really just one mountain. It's a bit of like a range. Yes, it's kind of like a mountain range. Imagine Medina's down here. Mecca, we know, is further south of Medina, right? So what the Meccans did was, instead of going straight into Medina, they went around the coast and then came back down from the north. So they set up camp just on the base of Uhud. That night, the Prophet ﷺ has a dream, and he sees in his dream that several of the close companions will die at Uhud, and he himself will be injured. However, the leader of the Meccans will also be killed. And he tells this to the Sahaba. So it's an ominous dream that he's had. Now, Medina is quite fairly well fortified. Remember when I was describing Medina, I said Medina wasn't necessarily one big city. It was a series of fortified townships. So even if one township fell, there was another one. If that fell, there was another one. And these were quite well fortified with walls. So the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Ubaidah, who's Abdullah ibn Ubay, strangely, both of them say that we should stay in Medina. Who's Abdullah ibn Ubay? Yes, the hypocrite. And a lot of the older companions who've seen warfare also say we should stay in Medina. It's fortified, we have a better chance, and they greatly outnumber us. When the Prophet ﷺ manages to get his forces together, they only number 700. 1,000. When he gets the forces together, they only number 1,000. So 3 to 1, right? So they say, for our advantage, let's stay behind the fortified walls. But a lot of the younger Sahaba who couldn't take part in Badr, they said, no, we need to go out, we need to fight, we need to make a name for ourselves pretty much. And we're not covered, we shouldn't stay behind. And arguments go backward and forward, to the point that one of the Sahaba actually said, look, if we go out and fight and we are victorious, good for us. If we go out and fight and they defeat us, good for us, because we're martyrs. Either way, it's good for us. So why are we so scared? Why do we have to hide behind walls? So this is the thinking, right? And remember what I said about the consciousness of the hereafter, all of them were like that. But finally, the people who wanted to go out and fight wins. And the Prophet ﷺ says, okay, if that's the majority decision, even if it's against my own views, let's do this. So the Prophet ﷺ goes back home, and Abu Bakr and Uthman go with him, and they start putting his armor on. After a while, once some of these Sahaba have calmed down, they start to panic. They start to think, oh no, we've pressured the Prophet into doing something he didn't like. They have never done that before. Their ego kind of got the better of him. And they start to stress. They start to stress about what the consequences of this is. Have we done something wrong? So they go to the Prophet ﷺ's house and they wait till he comes out. And when he comes out, where are you going, Zaid? You're going there? Can you just check if that's not expired? Because that's that thing in his hand. Can you check if he can eat it? So they wait for the Prophet ﷺ to come out, and the Prophet ﷺ comes out with his armor on, and they tell him, look, we're not sure about what we said before. You're the Prophet, you should have decided, we didn't want to pressure you. And the Prophet ﷺ says something. He's like, it is not right for a Prophet, once the armor is put on, to take it back off. A decision is made, let's face it, whatever comes. With that, the Prophet ﷺ mounts his horse, and with a bow and spear in hand, and 3 banners are given. One to Usayd ibn Hudayr, who is for the Aus. Now, Usayd ibn Hudayr, I'd be very impressed if any of you remember who he is. Ibn Hudayr. Usayd ibn Hudayr was the Aus that Sa'd ibn Mu'adh sent to chase the Muslims away when they were in Medina under Masud. Remember? And he came and became a Muslim and came back, and that annoyed Sa'd even more. And then Sa'd said, if you need something done, you have to do it yourself. So he went, and then he became Muslim. That was Usayd. Hubab ibn al-Mudir. Hubab was given the banner for the Khazraj. Hubab was the Sahaba who suggested that they capture the wells of Badr. So remember when they sent the wells, the Prophet ﷺ said, let's put up camp before, and he said, no, let's put them after. And Musab ibn Umari, who was sent to the Quraysh from Medina. So he was given the banner for the Quraysh to represent the Muhajirun. They all set off marching at a strength of 1,000 men. So 3,000 Meccans, 1,000 Muslims. The blind Sahaba, Abdullah ibn Maktoum, is once again left in charge of Medina, and he leads the prayers there. We know about Abdullah ibn Maktoum. On the eve of the battle, Hanzala ibn Abi Amr, who is an Aus, marries Jamila binti Abdullah ibn Ubay, who is a Khazraj. Now that's pretty significant. Prior to this, Aus and Khazraj never married. This was symbolic because it shows how Islam was now starting to change people. So Aus and Khazraj get married. But that night, Jamila sees a dream. And in a dream, he sees that a door to Jannah is opened at the foothills of Uhud. And her husband, her brand new husband, walks through the door and the door closes. She's very worried about this, but Hanzala says, if it is to be, it is to be. Another Sahaba, Abdullah ibn Amr, whose wife had recently died, sees a dream that he is martyred at Uhud. And he tells his only son, Jabir, look, you can't come with me. Because if both of us die, there's no one to look after your sisters. He had 7 sisters. And he said, you need to stay back. And this really depressed Jabir. It really affected him. And he was going to be one of the only men that was left. But his father said, no, you have to stay because there's no one else to look after them. Now, there was a blessing in disguise in this, and I'll get to that in a second. Just a side note, as Abdullah saw in his dream, he did die at Uhud, and Jabir was quite poor, and he really struggled to look after his sisters, and the Prophet ﷺ stepped in and helped him a lot. There's a story of once they were so poor that Jabir decided to sell one of their camels. And so the Prophet ﷺ went and bought the camel at the highest price, and then gave the camel back as a gift to him. And kept that family afloat. Now, halfway to Uhud, Abdullah ibn Ubay starts to say, we should never have come. I told you we should have stayed in Medina. This is silly, this is ridiculous. The battle's never going to happen anyway because the Meccans are never in it for the fight. I'm going back. And he turns around and goes back to Medina with 300 Muslims. That's a huge portion of the Medinan army. We went from 1,000 Muslims down to 700. They were already far outnumbered, 1 to 3. Now it's dropped even more. When this happens, quite a few of the other clans start to worry. Al-Imran verse 167, 168 describes that situation. 2 of the tribes, Bani Salima, who was a Khazraj, and Bani Haritha, who was Aus, also start talking about turning back. But Jabir ibn Abdullah, who was in Medina, was able to intervene. And because he was in Medina, he was able to talk to the chiefs of those tribes and convince them and remind them of their oaths and say, no, you can't do this. And so the chiefs then send a message to the tribe saying, no, keep going. Remember I said there's a blessing in disguise? For him, he thought it was the end of the world. His chance to be with the Prophet, fighting there and possibly even being a martyr. And he had to stay back to look after his sisters, But because of that, because he stayed back, he actually managed to maintain the Muslim army and prevent a total annihilation. Allahu Alam. But if those 2 tribes had left, they would have gone down even further, and who knows what could have happened. So that little incident, Jabir actually saved a lot of lives, even though he couldn't be in the battle himself. Now, 700 men set up camp on the base of Uhud. It's just here. And they choose a very particular spot. Can you guys see? They choose a very particular spot. On 2 sides, they are protected, right? This mountain is quite high and the Meccans cannot get through it. On one side, there is a little outcrop that protects them, but there's a little bit of a gap in between. And facing them are the 3,000 Meccans. On the western side, just here where the gap is, it's a small hill. If you've been to, and I have, when you go to Badr, you can actually see it. I've heard that the hill that's there now used to be much bigger. It's quite small now due to weather erosion and people taking rocks as souvenirs from there. But even then, it was surmountable. It wasn't like these areas. It was still surmountable. And the Prophet ﷺ was worried about this. So what he did was he set up 50 archers, 50, the best of the archers. And he told them to stand in that gap. And he said, if any cavalry, any horseman tried to outflank us through that gap, it's your job to stop it. 50 archers can do the job. See, if you know about any military strategy, cavalry versus archers, archers always get defeated, but that's provided the cavalry can get in close to the archers. If the cavalry is further back, it's the cavalry that gets slaughtered. And remember, we're not talking about European cavalry with heavy armor, we're talking about Arab archers. Now their job was to shoot down any cavalry that might try to attack the Muslims from behind. Now the Prophet ﷺ told them this is a very important job. You may feel like you're not in the battle, you may feel like you're just sitting there as reserves, but your job is so important. And he says this, whether we win the battle or lose it, stand steadily in your position and mind that we are not attacked from your side. If you see us snatched into pieces by birds, do not leave this position of yours till I send for you. And if you see that we have defeated the enemy and trodden on them, do not desert your position until I send for you. You can't emphasize it even more. He's like, you do not leave. You have to stay there. The Prophet ﷺ then puts on 2 coats of armor. Interesting. At Badr, it was a different story. He didn't put on 2 coats of armor. And even there are instances where he told Sahaba, take your armor off, go fight. You will be fine. But here he puts on 2 coats of armor. Scholars say that he was teaching the Muslims that while Allah will help, we must take every precaution to achieve success. And he may have also had an understanding of what was to come. Then the Prophet ﷺ takes a sword and says, I will give this sword to someone. Who is worthy of this sword? And quite a few of the great Sahaba, Abu Bakr, Uthman, they all put their hands up. He didn't give it to any of them. He gives it to, anyone know? Abu Dujana. He gives it to Abu Dujana. Now Abu Dujana makes a name for himself with this sword, and I'll tell you later. And Abu Dujana is so proud of this that he starts striding backwards and forwards in front of the Meccans, swinging his sword around and pretty much jeering at them. And the Prophet ﷺ sees this and he says, what he's doing, Allah hates that, except in this situation. This pride, this arrogance is showing off, not good, except when you're in battle, because it's part of the military tactic. It's part of getting the enemy side demoralized. Now, unlike the Medinans who've left their wives in Medina, the Meccans actually brought their wives with them, Hind being an example. But there were 2 Sahabi, Nusayba bint Ka'b and Sulaym bint Milhan. Nusayba will come up again. She is a warrior woman, honestly. You'll see what happens. So, the battle commences. On the Meccan side, there are 3 battalions, each consisting of 1,000 soldiers. Abu Sufyan leads the middle battalion. Ikramah is on the left flank or the western flank, and Khalid ibn Walid is on the right flank. Khalid ibn Walid has gone down in history as one of the few people, I think there's only 3 individuals who has never ever been defeated, ever. Not in a small skirmish, not in a great war. There is a beautiful story of when Khalid is very old and he's on his deathbed and his friend comes to visit him, and Khalid, this is, mind you, he becomes Muslim. Right now he's not Muslim, so we're jumping ahead when he becomes Muslim. And he's crying and he's saying, look at my body. There is not even a palm's length on my body where there isn't a mark, a wound, a stab wound, an arrow shot, a slice from the sword. Yet I didn't die a martyr. I'm dying an old man in bed. Why is this right? Why did this happen? I wanted to die a martyr. And his friend says, the Prophet ﷺ, once you became Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ gave you the title Saifullah, which is the sword of Allah. Right? And he said, if you had died, that means the sword of Allah was broken. That can never be. So by giving you that title, you were already predetermined that you will die an old man on your deathbed. Yeah. And that comforted him a lot. But that's Khalid standing there. Now the armies face each other, and Abu Sufyan steps out and tells the Muslims, we have no quarrels with the Aus and Khazraj. They're not our problem. We never have a problem with you. If you guys leave, we won't hurt you. Abandon the Muslims. Just go back to your homes. This is responded with jeering, laughter, and mocking. Most of the Aus and Khazraj are Muslims. They're like, what are you talking about? We made an oath. We're not going to do that. And to Hanzala's shock, who is now standing beside the Prophet ﷺ, his own father, Abu Imr ibn Safi, steps up from behind Abu Sufyan and tries to implore the Aus to go back, his clan, to go back. And again, he's met with jeers and laughter and said, yeah, we'd rather die. No thanks. From the Meccan side, Talha ibn Abdullah of Abdar steps forward and challenges the Muslims to a hand-on-hand duel. Like at Badr, 1-on-2, or usually it was the Arab tradition that before the massive battle happened, there'd be a 1-on-1 duel. 1-on-1 or 2-on-2 or 3-on-3, so on. Talha steps forward, and as Talha steps forward, 2 of his brothers and 4 of his sons also step forward, so it's 7. Ali and Hamza and a few other Sahaba from the Muslim side step forward. Ali dispatches Talha almost immediately. Gives you an idea of what great swordsman he was. Ali was well known for his swordsmanship. Yeah, he was pretty much. Hamza, with his strength, dispatches his brother, and some of the companions together dispatch the rest of the Meccans. So already in the first blows, the Meccans are defeated. And it's a morale boost for the Medinans. But soon as the duel ends and the Meccans realize that the Muslims have won, they take their arms and they charge. So what happens is the 3 battalions charge straight down the middle, and the Muslims, which is 650, so 50 up here, so it's only 650, 650 versus 3,000, charge and head on collide into each other. In this battle, Abu Dujana is literally, the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba are in awe. He's literally cleaving his way. Nothing gets close to him. He's literally wreaking havoc right down the center. He goes so far into the Meccan lines that he gets to where the women are at the back. And he gets to hint and almost goes to kill her, and then realizes he's reached the women and that it's hints a woman, and turns around and starts fighting back all the way back. Literally carves through the Meccan army using the sword that the Prophet ﷺ gave. Meanwhile, while all this battle's happening, Washi, he's not fighting anyone. He's sneaking around the battlefield, trying to find one particular person, Hamza. Hind has promised Washi that if you kill Hamza, I will give you your freedom. Washi was a slave. And the reason Hind wants Hamza dead is that Hamza in the battle of Badr killed her father, and she wants revenge, and she is so obsessed and so insane for revenge that she actually swears that if Hamza dies, she is going to eat Hamza's liver. She's lost her head. That's how much revenge she wants. Washi sneaks around the battlefield and spies Hamza, fighting valiantly. And soon as he sees an opening, he throws his javelin and it pierces Hamza. And Hamza very sadly passes away on the battlefield. To this day, if you go to Badr, there is a stone where you can see the exact spot that Hamza died, which I have seen. Yeah, there lives a little rock they keep there. You can see that. Now the battle has become intense, but the Muslims are fighting vigorously, and little by little they start gaining ground. And the Meccans, like at Badr, start falling back. And soon it's 1 step, 2 steps, and then it's starting to become a full-on retreat. While that's happening, Khalid and his force is kind of hanging back. They haven't gone right into the middle of it. He's kind of hanging back. And the archers that are on the hill, they say, well, that's it. We've won. We've won again, just like Badr. And they decide the battle's over. If we stay back here, we're not going to get any of the loot. Everyone's going to collect all the loot before we get there. We need to go and collect them. And against the wishes of the person who was left there, I think it was Abdullah ibn, what's his name? I forgot his name. A great Sahaba, Abdullah ibn something. He was asked to look after the archers. He begs them, he pleads them, do not leave. Remember what the Prophet ﷺ says. But no, 40 of the archers leave and come downhill to pick up the loot. Khalid and Ikramah sees this. And immediately, approximately 2,000 horsemen reel around, go around and ride over and smashes into the 10 archers. Every single archer that was there, including Abdullah, is martyred straight away. They didn't have a chance. What's 10 archers going to do against 2,000 cavalry? They smash into them. Every single of them are martyred. They come down, kill nearly every archer that's picking the loot, and then smashes right into the back of the Muslims. And suddenly, the Muslims realize that they are fighting on two fronts. The 1,000 led by Abu Sufyan from the front, and now the 2,000 led by Ikramah and Khalid, approximately from the back. And because of the savagery and because they were cavalry, the rear guard starts to fall and crumble. The Muslims start to fall. And remember, the Prophet ﷺ is right there, right in the middle of it. The Muslims are terrified. They didn't know what's happened. They can't understand why this is happening. And they start to flee. Most of them start to flee up into the mountains of Uhud. Surah Ali Imran verses 153 actually talks about this. I'll read it to you. When you were scrambling up the slopes of Mount Uhud in full retreat, not even noticing those around you, the Messenger ﷺ was behind you, calling you to come back and face the enemy, but you ignored him. So God brought the disappointment and shame upon you, even as you disappointed the Prophet ﷺ by running away from him. This added shame befell you so that you wouldn't feel bad only for the war prices you missed, but also for what you suffered as well. And God is well informed of all that you do. That's a hard surah that came down on the Muslims that day. The Prophet ﷺ and several loyal, brave companions still continue fighting, and they are backed right up to the base of Uhud. Wahab al-Muzani, from the coastal tribe of the Muzaina, was one of the chiefs. He says, I will protect the Prophet at all costs. Now remember, Wahab is not a Medinan. He didn't actually spend a lot of time with the Prophet ﷺ, but in that short amount of time, he fell in love with him. And he says, I'm going to protect him. And Wahab fights so ferociously and so valiantly that the Prophet ﷺ and all the companions are shocked at how little disregard he had for his life. His only goal was to protect the Prophet ﷺ. And he fights and fights and fights until he's overwhelmed. Literally, the Meccans start falling on him. And after the battle is over and they find his body, he had so many puncture wounds that Omar, who was the strongest of them all, starts to cry, seeing this Sahaba. And yet, the loyal companions make a ring around the Prophet ﷺ and they continue to fight, continue to protect the Prophet. Abu Bakr's own son, Abdul al-Qab, remember Abdul al-Qab is not a Muslim, remember I said that? He rides up and challenges the Muslims and says, is any of you going to fight me? And Abu Bakr stands up and says, I will fight you. You're my own son and I will fight you. And the Prophet says, no, I won't let you do that, because he doesn't want a father fighting a son, and tells Abu Bakr, come back and sit down. Abu Dujana, Ali and Talha managed to rally the Sahaba around the Prophet ﷺ just enough to push them back a little bit and to give the Prophet ﷺ some space. But in the frenzy, as all this is happening, a heavy blow lands on the Prophet. A massive blow, and it is so heavy that the chain mail he was wearing, some of the links go into his flesh and is embedded in his cheeks. And the Prophet ﷺ collapses. Nusayba, who hasn't actually been in the battle yet, the Sahabi, sees this, and she jumps into the fray with a dagger. Literally, she throws herself into the fray. And she stands over the Prophet and swishes her dagger around, protecting him, and makes a space just enough for Uthman and I think Talha to grab the Prophet ﷺ and drag him away. You know, I don't know. But just as that blow happened and Nusayb was jumping in, a second blow actually came to the Prophet. And that would have been the death blow. That would have killed him, if not for Talha, who shielded the Prophet and deflected the blow. The Prophet ﷺ is then taken to a cave near the base of Uhud. Now this cave, if you go to Medina, very few people know of this cave. And actually the Saudi government has put cement and concreted it up because people used to go there. But before I went, one of my friends who's been there before said, when you go there, make sure you have a good sniff. And he said, the reason is that in that cave, you will always smell the smell of musk. Now, you can be critical and say maybe someone goes in there and throws some musk. I don't know. But when I went there was no one there because people don't know about it. It's pretty much in the suburbs. You have to go through these little suburban streets. And the taxi driver who took us also didn't want to get out of the car because he was so scared that the Saudi government would find out, because they don't want people visiting these sites. And it was concreted up about 80%. There was a little gap. And some of my friends managed to crawl and jump in. I couldn't get up there with my bad knee. But even standing outside the cave, I personally smelled musk. Now, it's up to you to say what it was, but there was no one there. But I could smell the scent of musk like you have in Atar from that cave. And some scholars say that it is because that is where the Prophet ﷺ bled. And his blood stained the stones, and that smell is still there. Allahu Akbar. When the Prophet ﷺ collapsed though, some of the Muslims thought he had died. And Anas ibn Nadir says, what are you waiting for? What do you live for now that the Prophet's gone? Come on and die. Come on and die for what Allah and the Messenger has brought. So instead of panicking and demoralizing, the Sahaba were like, well, he's gone. What's the point? Let's fight for now the message that he was brought. And they actually start fighting even more intensely. The Prophet ﷺ regains consciousness, and Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah uses his teeth to he tries to pull the chain links up, but it's so deeply embedded that Abu Ubaidah has to put his teeth into the links and pull it out. And as he's pulling it out, blood starts to gush down his face. The Prophet ﷺ then climbs to a small hill. He's still very unsteady on his feet, but he climbs to a small hill and he stretches out his hands so that all the Muslims can see and all the Quraysh can see. And he says, how can a people who cut the face of their Prophet and broke his teeth, he who calls them to worship Allah, how can such people thrive or be successful? And then, after a small break, he says, my Lord, forgive my people, for they have no knowledge. Even in that state. Now, for those who are former Christians amongst us, does that ring a bell? Forgive my people, for they do not know what they do. And the Prophet ﷺ said the same thing. He was so worried that the cut on his face would have a bad impact on his enemies. He was like, my God, they made a prophet of God bleed. What will Allah do to these people? And he was more worried about them than he was about himself. And when the Sahaba see he's alive, they continue to fight, and they start falling back, but they don't retreat. It's not a frantic retreat. Every step they take, they make sure that the Prophet's protected, and they slowly start fighting their way back uphill and retreating. Ubay ibn Khalaf charges up to the ring of the companions protecting the Prophet ﷺ and says, where is Muhammad? Either I will kill him or he will kill me. And this is what happens. The Prophet ﷺ stands, he pushes the Sahaba aside, and he comes to the front, and he says, and he shook himself clear from them as if they had been no more than flies on a camel's back. Then he took a spear from Harith ibn Asimah and stepped in front of them all. Not daring to move, they looked on in awe at his grim and deadly earnestness. As one of them said, when the Messenger of Allah made a deliberate effort towards some end, there was no earnestness that could compare with his. Ubayd approaches with his drawn sword, and the Prophet ﷺ sends the spear flying, and it nicks Ubayd's throat. Nicks it. Question: has the Prophet ﷺ in all this time ever killed anyone, even if it's in battle? Despite the fact that he was in the front of every battle, and despite the fact that he fought in every battle, he never personally killed anyone. In this instance as well, Allah made it a very interesting situation. So there was an oath. Ubayd made an oath. Either you will kill me or I will kill you this date, right? And the Prophet ﷺ stood to that oath. He came and faced it. And he threw the spear and he nicked him. He didn't die. But that wound started to fester. And no matter what they did, it would get infected. And a few days later, he died from an infection. So the oath was fulfilled, but the Prophet ﷺ didn't necessarily kill him directly either. It's very interesting how that worked out.
Wasn't he saying on the way back to Mecca that Muhammad killed him?
He was so scared. He was like, oh my gosh, I made this oath and he's killed me. And everyone said, no, of course he's not killed you. You just got a nick, you're fine. And he's like, no, you don't know him. See, the thing is, the Quraysh,